What is art for? In all of its diverse forms, from ancient stories passed down by oral tradition to contemporary films, from 10,000-year-old cave paintings and cathedrals that took hundreds of years to complete, to modern art galleries, from the first hollowed-out drum instruments beating out prehistoric rhythms, to the symphonies of Beethoven, Stravinsky, and pop music. What are human beings about? Making and experiencing art. Understanding how a great piece of art is constructed is to understand how to construct a great life. In order to speak to the purpose of art, we must first address two universals of existence in their relation to art itself, that of evil and of meaning. The Buddha proclaimed as a foundational truth, primarily we are beings in the world who suffer. You, everything and everyone you hold precious, is subject to a process of entropic degeneration in the form of disease, debilitating oldness, tragic misfortune, and eventually and inevitably, death. Suffering cannot be rationalized into inexistence. One cannot talk oneself out of one's own pain. Therefore, we must suffer. Another fundamental aspect made manifest in the world, beyond natural evil the Buddha described, is that of moral evil. Within the Christian tradition, the sufferings of this type of evil reached an apogee in the person of Jesus Christ. This tradition accounts for a morally perfect individual who willingly took the burden of moral evil upon his shoulders, archetypally as King of Kings or Hero of Heroes, and symbolically in the form of the cross. Christ's sufferings caused by this type of evil could be cast as the intentional desire to make the suffering of existence worse as an end in and of itself. The manifestation of this evil is described in the biblical book of Job. In the story, God describes Job to Satan as a blameless and upright man who turns away from evil. Satan, called the accuser, strikes a wager with God. If God removes the protective hedge from Job and Satan is allowed to unjustly persecute him, then, Satan prophesies, Job would curse God to his face. The wager is accepted by God, and Satan proceeds to destroy all that Job owns, murders his children, and inflicts Job with severe illness. In the end, although Job nearly rebukes God, he does not. Satan loses the wager, and Job is restored twofold. A comedy, alas. Now consider Satan's actions. He wagered God, an omnipotent being. Surely Satan knew he would stand to lose such a wager. What must we then make of his intentions? What is Satan after? In the context of this story, a single answer must come forth. Evil for evil's sake. Although evil is often masked by a veil of naivete, good intentions, or rationalized by an ends justifies the means mentality, at bottom perhaps, evil is its own justification. And yet, another remarkable fact of existence, adjacent to our suffering of evils, is that we all have the deep-seated intuition that our world ought not to consist of it. From our immediate experience of what we deem to be evil, we also deem it should be otherwise. What accounts for this discrepancy between our uniformed experience of suffering in the world and our universal denunciation that the world must not be the way that it is? When, in fact, we have experienced no other world to compare the one we find ourselves. Just where is paradise to be found? This otherworldly paradox is a juxtaposition with our internal moral perceptions when we tell ourselves we ought to or ought not to act in a particular manner, and act contrary to our moral intuitions. Who among us is not subject to evil? Conversely, what subject is free of evil? Life, it seems, is beset by two of its forms, the cold indifference of natural evil and the all too insidious intentions of moral evil. We suffer evils, we both allow it and bear it, but do we suffer meaninglessly? We may ask ourselves the analogous question, is life a tragedy or a comedy? Is meaning itself real or a useful illusion? Meaning is inextricably connected to intentionality. Intentionality is inseparable from consciousness, and consciousness, scientifically speaking, is the blackest of all black boxes. All we can say of consciousness is that it is something. And yet, paradoxically, consciousness is the only thing that we experience directly. The ontological bedrock of meaning itself is found in the answer to a question as old as philosophy itself. The question being, what is the ultimate nature of reality, mind or matter? If matter is primary, consciousness and meaning are illusory, and must be explained through a mindless, bottom-up, Darwinian paradigm and as metaphysically unreal, but useful in the aid to survival and reproduction. However, if mind is primary, consciousness and meaning are maximally real. How does one know the answer to this foundational question? The answer? Those who act as if mind is primary, believe mind to be primary. Conversely, those who act as if matter is primary, believe matter to be primary. This is an old method of determining what people actually believe as opposed to what people say they believe. Christ, in a Sermon on the Mount, proclaimed, "By their fruits ye shall know them." 3 axiomatic assumptions are made by those who believe mind to be primary. 1. I have free will and I act and treat others as such. 2. The thoughts and actions I carry out are objectively meaningful. 3. Reality is intelligible. I act as though it can be rationally grasped and communicated. The vast majority of human beings believe these axioms to be true, as that they act them out in their lives. Individuals who act out these assumptions believe mind to be primary, regardless of any claims appealing to materialism or naturalism. The discontinuity of an individual who claims a naturalistic worldview and acts to the contrary is divided within themselves. They have not integrated their proclaimed worldview into actions. And as Carl Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This leaves the third category of human being who believes and thus acts out a worldview in a deterministic, nihilistic, and anti-realistic manner. However, this worldview is simply untenable because it is unlivable. That being said, nihilism does have its dark place in our contemporary culture and must be cautiously and wisely confronted as a man confronts a venomous animal. If our intuitions and actions are correct that we do suffer evils of this world, but we do not suffer meaninglessly, we are on sound footing to combat the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and sinister intentions with a shield of faith and a sword of truth. But where can such life-preserving commodities be found? Because we suffer evils, perhaps the art should be used as a means to escapism. Should art remove us from our reality and numb the mind of our burdens? It's evident when one looks at some genres of film, in particular the contemporary music industry, that there is a demand for art to this end. Are these escapists in error in their use of art? It must certainly be the case. All branches of psychology have converged on very few substantive conclusions, but one conclusion they have universally agreed upon is, unless a psychological neurosis is identified and confronted, it always remains, and furthermore, it festers and grows. Retreating from the realities of the world with a smartphone and earbuds in a perpetual, heedless, and unreflective manner parallels that of a mild, yet sustained, intoxication of the mind. And when the narcotic is put down, the individual is that much less prepared to confront themselves and the world as it is. There's a dark irony in how art is utilized in much of our contemporary culture, in that the proper role of the arts have been, by and large, flipped on their head when art compounds suffering as opposed to being a means of understanding and confronting it. So, if we act as if we meaningfully suffer as individuals, and we ought not to escape from our suffering because we cannot escape from our suffering, what is one to do? The early 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer believed that the arts were a primary means in both temporarily alleviating suffering, accessing truth concerning the nature of reality and of ourselves. Friedrich Nietzsche, using Schopenhauer's work as a model, reached many of the same conclusions for a time. Similar to Buddhist philosophy, Schopenhauer's conception of suffering was that it was caused by what he called will or desire. But as one experiences a piece of art, they find themselves for a moment in time in a state of pure, aesthetic contemplation. They become free of willing, and thus suffering is temporarily relieved. Schopenhauer's solution to suffering provides a partial answer to combat the evils of the world, but it is all too similar to the escapist role of art. Moreover, if Schopenhauer is mistaken in his metaphysical presuppositions, he errs in his aesthetic conclusions. The solution to the problem of suffering caused by evils projected onto the world is not to be found in retreating from the world, but discovering and mining out truths from within the world and of ourselves. Truth, properly conceived, is an innate good, construed as a bifold concept of both correspondence and pragmatist theories of truth. Ultimate truth must exist for any utterance to in fact be true, and our minds must correspond to the world as it is. But, as Immanuel Kant argued, we do not have access to ultimate truth due to our cognitive and conceptual constraints. However, we must act in the world as though we do have access to truth. In this manner, to be in the world is to make a Kierkegaardian leap of faith when one acts. As such, truth is subjectivity. As Kierkegaard observed, life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. We use rationality to contemplate truth, but we must act in the world to know truth. Likewise, I can possess all the factual information about the color red, but I do not know it until I see it, and seeing is acting. As we as individuals confront the world, our finitude comes into focus as we contemplate the limitless choices with the realization we have but a few opportunities in which to choose. As we must live life forwards, we must act with incomplete knowledge, no access to ultimate truth of reality, and with a complete ignorance as to the full consequences of the choices we make. Thus, to act in the world is to risk acting. And to risk genuine action is to act with passion, courage, and faith. If we genuinely act in the world, we are able to gather more pieces of truth to construct a greater and truer picture of the world. This process becomes dynamic and self-propelling. The more truth one possesses, the more truth one is able to possess. As Christ observed regarding truth and knowledge, whoever has will be given more, and they will have in abundance. What then is the greatest sources of truth and of knowledge? That depends on the manner and truth of knowledge we are looking for. Truth regarding how the world is, science and mathematics has much to tell us. But with regarding how we ought to act in the world, we must turn our gaze towards art and stories. Art can help us to not simply understand evil and the nature of suffering, but it can be a defensive and offensive tool to confront it. Great art, properly conceived, is the abstracted fictional illusion that, paradoxically, has the capacity of leading us in proximity of truth that we might be infused of it, and that we may act out truth in the world, and perhaps, at times, we may touch the hem of its garment. What are humans about making and experiencing art? We seek it to utilize it as a sword and buckler to overcome the suffering caused by evil, that we may infuse our lives with truth and of meaning.